Well, it's Friday the 13th of March. Mercury will re-enter Pisces on the 16th, now kicking his winged feet madly against its fast-flowing waters. Like a dream, progress might seem slow or non-existent, but it is the exertion of energy that will define the next period into the equinox. This is episode 2010 of 301 Permanently Moved Online, a personal podcast 301 seconds in length, written, recorded and edited in 1 hour by me at the JMO. Today's episode is a little weird. I couldn't focus my thoughts this morning. What you're about to hear is some sort of free-writing essay that seems to be more dream logic than coherent argument. I'm away next week, but Hugh Lemmy will be here in the 301 hot seat with a coherent episode on the peasant crusaders of the Middle Ages. It's funny, isn't it? As the days pass to slowly become aware that you are alive in a time of capital H history, that the collective narrative has reached you personally and woven you into its plot. Everyone is potentially now a main character. The zeitgeist is here, lads. Get it a beer. The time ghost has come to haunt you. Last year in episode 1921, on Spider-Man's MCU No Deal website, I talked about my suspicion that big media, an industry that rides and exploits the zeitgeist, had gotten stuck in a Fukuyamian fugue state, unable to break out of remixing the past. History, however, never stops, much to the chagrin of the people who run our economy and political parties. Things continue to unfold, the sun comes up, and the sun goes down. In the History Manifesto by Joe Goldie and David Armitage, they write, regardless of the age or security of income, we are all in the business of making sense of a changing world. In all cases, understanding the nexus of past and future is crucial to acting upon what comes next. But who writes these changes as a long-term developments? Who nourishes those looking for brighter futures with the material from our collective past? Centuries and epochs are often mysteries too deep and wide for journalists to concern themselves with. Only in rare conversations does anyone notice that there are continuities that are relevant and possible to see. Who is trained to wait steadily upon these vibrations of deeper time and then translate them? I sometimes wonder about the boomers, brought up on a diet of Cold War propaganda and a childhood psychic environment of the threat of nuclear conflagration that could begin at any moment. I wonder if this explains many of their generational quirks. I also sometimes think that the children of 68 not only won, but continue to win, at the expense of everyone else, the way a steeplejack carries the ladder up behind them. Their revolution is still ongoing, and they continue to fight hard for it. I don't like generational politics, as I think that way leads to 21st century fascism. Joe and David's book calls for a return of grand narratives of history, long-term thinking both backwards and forwards. I agree with them and really support their point of view and project. But when the time ghost is at the door, you don't need to stray far into any history book to see yourself in its pages. When pestilence swept through the whole known world in 541 AD, wiping out most of the farming community, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake, the then Byzantine Emperor Justinian showed no mercy towards the ruined freeholders. Even then, he did not refrain from demanding the annual tax, not only of the amount of which he assessed each individual, but for the amount of which his deceased neighbours were liable too. During that time in Constantinople, 1500 years ago, 10,000 people were supposed to have been dying in a day, and yet the power structures still demanded its tithe. Could you imagine it back then, having to pay your dead neighbour's taxes as well as your own, in the midst of all of that trauma? Boomers were also the first generation to get fully vaccinated. Deadly influenza, measles, mumps, smallpox, polio, cholera, and many more are words that when you speak their name out loud should carry the full weight of their historical traumas. We are here because others aren't. The grandfather of stacktivism, John Snow, drew his map in 1854, creating the discipline of epidemiology, a science that most people hadn't heard of until perhaps a week ago. But despite its acclaim and influence, every dot on his map is a local and very human trauma, an event that killed 616 people. Can you imagine it? When I read a history book, I try to put my mind towards these people's everyday experiences. What must it have been like to exist in a world that seemed so random, so cruel? Plague of Athens during the second year of the Peloponnesian War literally created philosophy. The people of ancient Greece experienced a crisis of meaning very similar to the one we are living through today, and they began to think their way out of the void. Yesterday's market crash, the worst since 1987 alone, would be the front page news under any other narrative framing, but it's not. The 1.5 trillion in Treasury's loans announced yesterday isn't really either. We could be witnessing the wholesale breakdown of our institutions in real time, the social contract associated with democratic rule, the media, the healthcare industry, and the higher ed industrial complexes. There have been many people calling online for artists and musicians and writers to make their best art. Perhaps like the ancient Greeks, all of these events will compound and accelerate the meaning crisis towards a conclusion. There's no money for healthcare, but there's 1.5 trillion for liquidity in the treasuries markets. There's no money for free schooling, but there's money for endless war on terror. Perhaps from this moment, new epistemologies will arrive. It is not a time to scoff and be reactionary about other people's emerging understandings of the nature of the world around us. Make some art, or make some music, and tell me how you feel about the ghost who's at the door.